Nobody tells you that the people who love hardest are usually the ones who end up most alone. Not because they love wrong, not because they're broken, not because they scare people away on purpose, but because the way they love, the depth of it, the speed of it, the complete and total unfiltered realness of it, operates on a frequency that most people have never been tuned to receive. And what happens when you broadcast on a frequency nobody around you can pick up? The signal sounds like noise. And you spend years wondering why the connection keeps failing when the whole time the problem wasn't the signal, it was the receiver. If you are someone who loves with your entire nervous system, who feels a stranger's sadness across a crowded room, who absorbs a partner's anxiety before they've said a single word, who gives and gives until there is nothing left and then blames yourself for running empty, this video is going to name something you have felt your entire life, but probably never been able to explain. And I need you to stay with me all the way to the end. Because the last thing I'm going to tell you is the one thing nobody in your life has ever said directly to your face. And it's going to change the way you see every relationship that's ever hurt you. Let's start with the thing that nobody wants to admit. People who feel deeply are some of the most chronically misunderstood people in any relationship. Not because they're complicated, because they're operating on a completely different neurological level than most of their partners. Here's what I mean. Most people process emotions sequentially. Something happens, they feel something, they evaluate it, they decide how to respond. There's a gap between the stimulus and the reaction. That gap is where most people live their relational lives. But a small percentage of the population, researchers estimate somewhere between 15 and 20%, are born with a nervous system that processes sensory and emotional information at a fundamentally deeper level. This isn't a personality choice or a spiritual identity. It's neurobiology. The term in research is high sensory processing sensitivity, first identified by psychologist Elaine Aron in the 1990 seconds. What does that mean in practice? It means the gap between stimulus and reaction is almost non-existent. It means emotion arrives before logic can catch it. It means other people's moods register in your nervous system the way weather registers on skin. You don't decide to feel it, you just do. And when you take that nervous system and put it inside a romantic relationship, especially with a partner who processes emotion normally, you get a collision that neither person fully understands and both people interpret as the other person's fault. That collision is what we're going to talk about today. Because the struggles aren't random. They aren't bad luck. They follow a specific, identifiable pattern. And once you see the pattern clearly, you can finally stop blaming yourself for a dynamic that was structurally almost impossible from the beginning. Here's the first thing that derails these relationships, and it happens before most people even realize they're in one. The depth arrives before the safety does. When someone who feels everything meets someone new, the experience for them is immediate and total. Within the first few conversations, they're not just attracted, they're seeing. They're reading the architecture of that person, the old wounds, the hidden fears, the potential that the person themselves might not have recognized yet. They feel a kind of knowing that is genuinely difficult to explain to someone who has never felt it. And because they feel it so completely, they assume it must be mutual. It isn't, not yet. The other person might be interested, they might even be captivated, but they haven't processed anything close to what the deeply feeling person has already experienced. They're still in the early data collection phase of attraction. The deeply feeling person is already 3 emotional chapters ahead, speaking from a place of genuine connection that the other person hasn't arrived at yet. And what happens when one person is 3 chapters ahead? The person behind feels like they're being rushed, like they're expected to feel something they haven't been given time to feel. And instead of reading this accurately, as intensity, not manipulation, the brain does what all brains do when faced with disproportionate input. It registers threat. Not danger in the physical sense, threat in the relational sense. The subtle alarm that says, Something about this ratio is wrong. And the deeply feeling person, who is just being honest, watches someone they were genuinely connecting with start to pull away, and they have no idea why. Because from their side, everything felt real, everything felt right. The tragedy isn't that they moved too fast, the tragedy is that they were moving at the exact speed their nervous system was reporting as true. And the nervous system was right. It's just that truth, delivered before someone is ready to receive it, doesn't land as truth. It lands as pressure. Now, here's where it gets more complex. And this is the part that relationship content almost never talks about honestly.
The second pattern that wrecks these relationships isn't about the other person at all. It's about what happens inside the deeply feeling person when they're in proximity to emotional dishonesty. Most human beings maintain a certain baseline level of social performance in relationships. Not lying exactly, just the normal editing everyone does. I'm fine when you're a little tired. A smile that's 70% real, keeping minor irritation private. This is standard human behavior. It's how most people manage emotional bandwidth in relationships. For the deeply feeling person, this is experienced as noise. Not because they're overly suspicious, not because they're paranoid, but because their nervous system is literally registering the gap between what the person is saying and what the person's body, tone, and energy are communicating. Think about what the body communicates. Micro-expressions that flash across the face in 250 milliseconds. Changes in vocal rhythm that signal emotional suppression.
Subtle shifts in breathing pattern that indicate anxiety. Changes in physical posture that reflect internal conflict. Most people don't consciously detect these signals, but the nervous system of a highly sensitive person is processing them constantly, below the threshold of conscious thought. It's like having a scanner running in the background of every interaction. And when the scanner detects a mismatch between the spoken message and the body's transmission, which happens dozens of times a day in any normal relationship, it sends a signal to the conscious mind. Something isn't adding up. This creates a very specific relational problem. The deeply feeling person can't just let it go. Not because they're controlling, because the mismatch keeps generating a low-level alarm that doesn't turn off until it's resolved. And the only way to resolve it is to name it. So they name it. You seem upset. What's actually going on?
And the other person, who was just having a normal bad day that they were managing privately, suddenly feels interrogated, surveilled, like they can't exist in their own internal experience without it becoming a relationship conversation. They get defensive. The deeply feeling person pushes harder, not because they want to fight, but because the mismatch alarm is still sounding, and they genuinely can't rest until it stops. What started as one person trying to close a connection gap becomes a conflict neither person intended to start. Multiply this across months, across years. You can see how the relationship becomes a minefield, not from malice, but from two entirely different nervous systems trying to coexist in a shared space with no map. Now I want to go deeper, because this next pattern is the one that causes the most long-term damage, and it begins with something that looks, on the surface, like the most beautiful thing about a deeply feeling person. The ability to see who someone could become. This is genuinely extraordinary. The capacity to look at a person who is currently struggling, currently guarded, currently operating from their worst self, and see underneath that to the real person, the potential, the version of them that pain hasn't finished crushing. It is an act of profound generosity, and it is also, in its unexamined form, a relational trap. Here's the mechanism. When you fall in love with someone's potential, you are not in a relationship with that person. You are in a relationship with a future version of them that does not yet exist. You are loving a projection. And projections, no matter how accurately they're imagined, cannot love you back. The real person in front of you, inconsistent, wounded, not yet healed,
is still doing the things they do, still pulling away, still breaking agreements, still unable to meet you at the depth you're offering. But because you can see who they could be, every moment of that real person's real behavior gets filtered through the lens of the idealized version. Their cruelty becomes a symptom of their wound. Their withdrawal becomes a defense mechanism that love can heal. Their repeated failures become evidence that they just need more time, more patience, more of you. This is not love. This is a renovation project with a human being as the building. And the deeply feeling person pours everything into this project: time, emotional bandwidth, the kind of sustained patience that most people cannot maintain, because they believe their depth of feeling will eventually reach the person behind the armor. Sometimes it does. More often, it doesn't. And after months or years of this one-directional investment, the deeply feeling person wakes up to a realization so disorienting it can feel like physical illness. They've been loving a person who never arrived, and somewhere in the middle of loving that absent person, they stopped attending to themselves entirely. This is where the real damage happens. Not in the dramatic moments, in the slow, quiet, daily accumulation of self-abandonment that looks from the outside like devotion. Now let's talk about something that sounds straightforward, but is actually one of the most psychologically complex dynamics in these relationships: the need to disappear. Not permanently, not out of indifference, but periodically, completely, with an urgency that feels to the deeply feeling person like basic survival. Here's why this happens. The human nervous system has a finite capacity for processing sensory and emotional input before it requires rest. For most people, this capacity is replenished through the normal rhythms of daily life: sleep, downtime, routine. The social battery drains and recharges on a relatively predictable schedule. For the deeply feeling person, the battery drains at a dramatically accelerated rate. Because they're not just processing their own emotional experience, they're processing everyone around them. Every interaction carries additional weight. Every relationship requires additional energy. Every conflict, every joy, every shift in the emotional atmosphere of a shared space demands something from their system that a less sensitive person would never notice. By the time a deeply feeling person needs to withdraw, they don't want quiet. They need it. The way someone who hasn't slept in 40 hours needs sleep. Physiologically, biologically, the system is demanding a pause. This is not emotional abandonment of the partner, but it is almost universally experienced as emotional abandonment by the partner. And here is where the dynamic destroys itself. The partner, reading the withdrawal as rejection, increases pursuit. More messages, more check-ins, more demands for explanation. And every attempt to close the gap actually makes the gap worse. Because the deeply feeling person, whose system is already overwhelmed, now has to process both the original overload and the partner's anxiety about the withdrawal. The pressure cooker, already at the limit, gets more heat. And the explosion, when it comes, looks completely disproportionate to the partner. They were just trying to reach the person they love. They had no idea they were adding weight to a system that was already past its limit. Neither person is wrong. Both people are operating from their own legitimate needs. But without a shared understanding of what's actually happening neurologically, those legitimate needs destroy each other. Now here's the darkest part of this whole pattern. The part that once you see it, you cannot unsee. Deeply feeling people don't just attract damaged partners by accident. They attract them by design. Not consciously, not willingly, but structurally, the qualities that make them extraordinary human beings: radical empathy, deep listening, boundless patience, an intuitive ability to make broken people feel safe, function as a beacon for people who are specifically seeking those qualities. Not to love, to use. And there is a specific type of person who is exquisitely calibrated to find that beacon in a crowd. The person who wants to be saved. Not healed, saved. There's a critical difference. The person who wants to be healed takes responsibility. They show up to the work. They meet effort with effort. They are grateful for the support and they use it to grow. The person who wants to be saved wants the relief of being understood without the discomfort of changing. They want a witness to their wound, not a challenge to outgrow it. And the deeply feeling person, with their extraordinary capacity to hold space for pain, becomes the perfect vessel for exactly this dynamic. The relationship begins with the deeply feeling person as the giver and the other person as the receiver. And because this ratio feels familiar, because many deeply feeling people learned early in life that their value was tied to what they could provide, it doesn't trigger an alarm. It triggers comfort. Only much later, after the investment has compounded over months or years, does the imbalance become undeniable. And by then, walking away feels like abandoning someone who needs you. Because that's what the other person will say. Because that's what the old story says love is supposed to endure. This is the moment that determines everything. Because the deeply feeling person is standing at a crossroads between two versions of loyalty. Loyalty to the relationship as it exists, exhausting, one-sided, slowly consuming. Loyalty to themselves, their own energy, their own future, their own capacity to love fully when they're not being perpetually drained. They cannot have both. And the choice they make here doesn't just determine this relationship, it sets the pattern for every relationship that follows. Here's what I want you to understand about that choice. Leaving a relationship that is draining you is not abandonment. It is not failure. It is not evidence that you loved wrong or gave too much or trusted too easily. It is evidence that you finally understood something that took extraordinary courage to accept. You cannot save someone who is using your effort to avoid saving themselves. And you cannot love anyone well, including yourself, while running on empty. The neuroscience here is actually quite direct. The brain under sustained emotional exhaustion shifts into a state researchers call compassion fatigue. The same phenomenon documented in nurses, therapists, and emergency responders. The neural circuits responsible for empathy literally begin to shut down. Not because the person stops caring, but because the system has exceeded its sustainable operating capacity. Compassion fatigue doesn't make you less loving, it makes you less capable. And continuing to give from that depleted state doesn't serve the other person, it just accelerates your own collapse. This is the scientific argument for the boundary you've probably been afraid to set. Taking care of yourself is not the opposite of taking care of others. It is the prerequisite for it. Now here's something I need to say clearly, and I want you to really hear it. Everything we've talked about today, the speed, the depth, the pattern detection, the withdrawal, the attraction to broken people, none of it is a flaw in your design. Not one thing. The highly sensitive nervous system is not a malfunction. It is, from an evolutionary standpoint, a feature. Research by Bianca Acevedo at UC Santa Barbara found that highly sensitive people show significantly greater activation in the brain regions associated with awareness, empathy, and processing complex social information. These are not the neural patterns of someone who feels too much. These are the neural patterns of someone who perceives more. You are not broken. You are calibrated for a depth of connection that most people will never experience. The problem has never been that you feel too deeply. The problem has been that you've been offering that depth to people who weren't ready for it, who didn't know what to do with it, who experienced it as pressure rather than gift because they'd never been in the presence of that kind of honesty before. The question is not, how do you feel less? The question is, how do you become more precise about where you direct what you feel? Here's the real answer to all of it. The answer underneath all the patterns, all the pain, all the relationships that cost more than they gave.
The deeply feeling person has one primary vulnerability. Not their sensitivity, not their speed, not their depth. Their willingness to pour from an empty cup. And that willingness doesn't come from weakness. It comes from a learned belief, usually formed very early, often in childhood, that love must be earned through provision. That if you stop giving, you lose the right to be loved. That belief is the root of every pattern we've talked about today. The movement toward people who need saving, the inability to honor your own exhaustion, the tolerance for one-sided dynamics, the terror of disappointing someone by saying no. All of it traces back to the same place, a story you were told about what love requires of you. And that story is wrong. Love, real love, equal love, the kind of love that sustains rather than depletes, does not require self-erasure. It does not reward self-abandonment. It does not get stronger the more you sacrifice. Real love asks you to show up whole, present, with something genuinely left to give. That is only possible when you stop treating your own capacity as a resource to be depleted for other people's benefit. The relationship you actually want, the deep, mutual, genuinely safe connection that your nervous system is built for, cannot be reached through the patterns we've described today. It cannot be reached by loving someone into becoming who you need them to be. It cannot be reached by making yourself indispensable to someone who hasn't decided to heal. It cannot be reached by proving your worth through the volume of what you give. It can only be reached by doing the one thing that feels the most counterintuitive to someone who has spent their life giving, requiring something in return. Not everything, not perfection, not instant emotional sophistication, but consistency, reciprocity. The basic evidence that you exist in this relationship as a full person, not just a function. That requirement is not selfishness. It is the minimum specification for a relationship that can actually hold the depth of what you carry. And here is the last thing I'm going to tell you. The right person will not be overwhelmed by how much you feel. They will be relieved by it. Because somewhere out there is a person who has spent their whole life feeling like they're too much for everyone around them. Too intense, too real, too honest, too deep. And they've been quietly wondering if there is someone on this earth who could actually hold all of it without flinching. When the two of you find each other, the thing that broke every relationship before will be the exact thing that makes this one unbreakable. Your depth is not a liability searching for the right apology. It is a gift searching for the right address. Stop delivering it to houses where nobody is home.